Just a few months ago in a beautiful Pennsylvania field, an assassin's bullet ripped through my ear. But I felt then, and believe even more so now, that my life was saved for a reason. I was saved by God to make America great again.
Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Mike Higgins, the editor of The World Today, the quarterly magazine of Chatham House, and I'm your host this week while Bronwyn is away in Davos. Donald Trump is now the 47th President of the United States, and he's wasting no time enacting his political and policy agenda. President Trump, as he is again, has signed a blizzard of executive orders. He has declared a state of emergency on the US southern border. He's pulling the US out of the Paris Climate Accord and the World Health Organization. He renamed the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America, paused the ban on TikTok, pardoned those involved in the January 6th attack on the Capitol, and signed an order attempting to end US birthright citizenship. And those are just some of the orders he enacted on day one. So what foreign policy changes has President Trump enacted in his first few days back in the White House? And where might his worldview take him and America? Well, I have some brilliant guests to help answer these questions and others. Leslie Vinjamuri is the director of our US and Americas program. Welcome, Leslie. This is your third time on the podcast this month, I believe.
Thank you. It's been a busy month for everybody.
Samir Puri has recently joined Chatham House as the director of our Centre for Global Governance and Security. Welcome, Samir.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
And joining us down the line is Susan Glasser, who is a staff writer at The New Yorker magazine and the author of The Divider, Trump in the White House, 2017 to 2021. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the inauguration itself and President Trump's speech. What, for you, were the key points or phrases which references to other countries stood out? Susan, as you were closest to the action of all of us, let's start with you.
Well, look, we're 8 years into the Trump phenomenon. So, one thing I think is that we should sort of dispense with the idea that there is any kind of a coherent ideology or policy agenda that is being enacted in any sort of a traditional way for whether it's a president or a prime minister. The theme of Donald Trump's speech, and I think the unifying theme of many of these otherwise hard to understand actions that we're seeing, is the personalist nature of the American government as conceived by Donald Trump. He sees himself as at the center of all actions. And that includes this very quirky ideology, which extends from his personal animus toward windmills being a recipe for his government to go after sources of renewable energy, to the personal vengeance campaign for those who, in his view, wronged him and, quote, weaponized the American legal system against him. And so if you're looking to try to make sense of the very disparate things, I think, do what Trump does. He puts himself in the center of every narrative. And that's what that inaugural address was so striking for in many ways, and different than any other inaugural address, including, by the way, his first inaugural back in 2017, which is that he married this dark view of the United States, the American carnage of 2017, with a focus on himself that verged on the grandiose. And that is something we've never heard from any American president in any of these inaugural addresses. Donald Trump's sentence that really, I think, stood out for me was when he said, "God saved me so that I can make America great again." He said that in his inaugural address. It's the first time, by the way, he's danced around formulations like that since his assassination attempt this summer. But this is something that I would really command your attention to, and that of all your listeners.
Samir, as the only non-American guest here today, looking in from the outside, as it were, what struck you about the speech?
The line that made me jump out of my skin was the line, "They will be annihilated." And I thought, well, what does he mean? But he meant challenges facing America will be annihilated. But when you actually then think about the speech from a foreign policy perspective, it's fairly light, as you'd expect on foreign policy. Bit of a Western Hemisphere-focused foreign policy touch point. So China's really only mentioned in terms of its stake, as Trump perceives it, in the Panama Canal. Mexico's mentioned. Nothing really about the rest of the foreign policy challenges that are being faced. But I was just left with an overall sense that, as with Trump, there's always a sense he's trying to just give the tone to his leadership, give the tone to his time in office as it starts now, and the details are to be implemented, and it's really working with the tone of it and how he's perceived by domestic and foreign audiences. That really is his calling card.
We'll come on to some of the foreign policy clues that we were given in the speech a little later, but one of the other striking elements I thought about the staging of the day was the prominent presence of Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, and other luminaries of the tech sector. I wonder what you inferred from that, Susan.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as if, Trump wanted to prove that there was something to Joe Biden's very pointed farewell speech, in which Biden had warned Americans that Trump was putting together what amounted to a new tech oligarchy. He referred back to Dwight Eisenhower's famous farewell speech, in which he warned Americans about the rise of what Eisenhower called a military-industrial complex, a concept that stuck with us for decades and that still in many ways exists today. Biden's addition to this was the idea of a tech oligarchy. And, if you look at what is different between now and the first Trump presidency. Well, Donald Trump isn't different. He's older and perhaps more undistilled and undiluted himself in many ways. He's angrier. He's got more grievance. But the big thing that is different is that he managed to attract this new coterie of essentially the wealthiest men in the world are now investors in, financial backers of, and key parties to and participants in the second Trump administration in a way that was certainly not the case 8 years ago. Elon Musk, the wealthiest man in the world, a man with very much at stake in the decisions of the U.S. government for his personal business interests. What we know is that he spent at least $250 million. That's $250 million. And again, that's the spending that we're aware of to get Trump elected in the 2024 campaign. Musk now has been rewarded with an office in the White House complex, with a new quasi-government entity charged with cutting government spending, presumably not the government spending that benefits his space companies and other things. And then you had also Jeff Bezos of Amazon, who has his own interest in space, the owner of the Washington Post, which is in the midst of quite an uproar over Bezos's Trumpy turn, Mark Zuckerberg, with a very influential information platforms of Meta. And so I think it's notable both because it suggests a way for Trump to stay in power politically, and also because it seems that they see some benefit for themselves. We're going to see what that benefit is. We don't know yet, but I think it's really important to note that it's all a particular kind of wealthy CEO that's there. People who are in the information business, people who are controlling what is truth in our tech-soaked society.
Leslie, the other thing watching that performance by President Trump was how self-assured he seemed, how relaxed he seemed.
Susan's, really articulated fabulously the information, the technology superstars that are right behind him. He did talk about manufacturing. He wants to have both. He wants to be able to say that he's bringing manufacturing back. It's part of why he's pushing hard on tariffs. He wants to get the automobiles inside of the United States, not only inside of the economic region that is part of the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement. But, I would also note that confidence, we don't know where it will go, but it does rest on eventually an ability to deliver. And if you look at what's happening even within those coalition supporters, I was just having a look at the announcement that was made, I guess it was last night or this morning for those of us in the UK, that there would be a $500 billion infrastructure investment on the artificial intelligence side. The president comes out sort of swinging, saying this. It's quite an extraordinary announcement. And just a few hours later, Elon Musk starts challenging it and saying he's not sure that some of the companies are going to be able to deliver. And as you watch all those men, CEOs, sitting in the inaugural, audience, they're deeply competitive with each other. And so there's not only a sort of question of keeping the working class part of his coalition, the manufacturing base, in keeping the tech, which is all about, free trade and deregulation and H-1B visas, which splinters the coalition. But it's also assuming that they're not going to just fall apart because they're competing with each other. So there's so many potential divisions that will and could erode that confidence. He wants to get a deal, between Russia and Ukraine. He's going to have to negotiate phase 2 in about 2 weeks from now of the ceasefire deal that's sitting there in the Middle East with a great deal of precariousness. So there, it is a specific moment. He's put out all those executive orders, but delivering is really something else again. And as prepared as he has been, America's civil society has also been preparing. So he says in one of his executive orders, he's going to get rid of birthright citizenship. And within hours, you've got 22 court cases filed because there's constitutional protection for birthright citizenship in the United States.
Striking, that sense of the performance of executive authority, which of course carried on that day with the slew of executive orders that he signed up on stage in the Capital One arena. I wonder, Samir, is that something you've seen anything like that in your career as a diplomat or working in policy world?
No, I mean, certainly not from an American president in the sense of this level of pent-up preparedness, because that wasn't there in the last Trump arrival. There was, I think, a degree of shock that he'd won, even within his own camp, probably to him personally as well. I'm sure he was delighted, but I think there was a sense of almost that this was too good to be true. And I think his ability to exercise his own self-control and to pick advisors and to do preparatory work in a way that I think was true to his own vision wasn't very realised, I think, in 2016, probably is much more so now. And I think the evidence is, in 2016, there was still the sense of some George W. Bush era holdovers, appointees, staffers who presumably been recommended to Trump, as this is someone who was Undersecretary this or Secretary of State there. And they aren't obviously present now. In fact, they're being vilified. Some of them are probably hunkering down, potentially preparing for retribution because they've been quite critical, they're traditional Republicans. So he's got a new generation of people coming in. I'm really struck by the fact that many of his appointees and close confidants within the government and cabinet are sort of his, like Ivanka Trump's age. They're sort of, late 30s, early 40s. So I think he's obviously got a very good sense of generational succession in his mind as a man with a large family. But I think with J.D. Vance, but with everyone around him like Kash Patel and FBI and things like that, there's clearly a sense of preparing a USA after Trump, where Trumpism and Trumpite thinking remains totally ingrained in the American system. That's probably one of his ambitions from this. In terms of the slew of things that he was signing, I would certainly say that things like the WHO, we may want to talk about some of these a bit later on. Obviously, they are very consequential, but those are the things that struck me.
Let's pick out some of the foreign policy implications from among these executive orders. For instance, he announced a national emergency on the US-Mexico border. Susan, can President Trump just close the border?
No. And this is a fever dream of his that he often articulated in his first term in office as well. Obviously, a man who is in theory focused on the economy and business. You can't close the border or our economy and the global economy would crash immediately. It's a certain kind of rhetorical talking point, but it does underscore what Trump believes is at the heart of his political appeal to his followers. He fervently believes that his attacks on immigration are the reason that he won election in 2016 and also why he won election again in 2024. So that's at the core of what he sees of as his political compact with his voters. So anything that he can do to make them feel that he's taking the biggest, toughest, boldest, strongest, meanest measures on immigration. Trump and his advisors, not all of them, but I think Trump himself and some of his advisors are targeting legal immigration here as well as illegal immigration. And that goes to your point about, can you just close the border, right? Can you just, stop all trade? No. And you can't stop all legal immigration either. We have laws here in this country. We do not have a king. And a lot of the theme of this first week is Trump essentially defying the other institutions of American government, whether it's the Congress that's passed these laws or It's the other executive agencies that may need to implement them, the Pentagon, if they're called upon to take part in a border crackdown, for example, or it's the courts, which have to enforce it when there is somebody who oversteps the bounds of legality. And there will be, as Leslie has pointed out, many, many lawsuits have already been filed about things like the birthright citizenship. Many aspects of this immigration policy will be challenged in court because Trump has a tendency to overreach, to overstep, and essentially to defy or to dare other institutions to stop him.
I wonder, Leslie, whether we're going to see Trump being able to follow through on some of his more bold policy announcements more successfully than he was in his, perhaps around the border and immigration issues, than he was in his first term.
Well, it's not entirely in his interest to follow through all the way. And he doesn't necessarily need to. To come back to some of what Susan was saying about the border, no, he can't close it. And B, he doesn't want to close it because it's a very successful economic region. There are trucks that go back and forth 8 times in a day to produce things that are sold that everybody benefits from. If you look, since Donald Trump renegotiated and got the USMCA, there's been a 134% increase in intra-regional capital investment in North America. There's been a 50% increase in trade, a lot of that to the benefit of the United States. Mexican Americans and Mexicans who come into the country contribute to low-wage jobs that Americans simply haven't been willing to fill. There are jobs chasing people in the U.S. economy, especially at the low-wage end of the economy, not people chasing jobs. So it's not in the interest of a president who wants to have a strong economy to follow through to the level and to the extreme that he's saying. It is in his interest if he can demonstrate gains on reducing, fentanyl coming across the border. It is in his interest, unfortunately, to have some nasty photos of some illegal immigrants being sent back so he can demonstrate to his base that he's delivering. We know also that once Mexicans and Mexican Americans who come into the country, the majority of their money stays in the country. They do send a healthy minority of it back to Mexico, but the majority of it stays in the country. So it is a very positive relationship with some downsides. What he didn't note in that inaugural were all the things that President Biden had done after a period when there was a genuine crisis at the border to try and correct that. And so actually, by the time he inherits that border, it's in a much better place than it was even a year or 18 months prior. So he's got a pretty good baseline to work with. He's removed some of the things, the CBP-1 app that provided a mechanism for managing asylum seekers so that they came into the country with appointments already in place. He's getting rid of some of those things. And in doing so, he's going to, create headaches for himself. Obviously for Mexico and most obviously for the people who are trying to legitimately seek asylum.
Samir, another sort of area around which we're getting perhaps slightly mixed messages is tariffs, for instance. So we've been told by President Trump how much he loves tariffs repeatedly. And yet so far, I know it's early, very early days, so far there haven't been great announcements. The suggestion perhaps there'll be 10% blanket tariffs on Chinese imports, but nothing else so far.
Well, I think the threat, the spectre of tariffs is the opening gambit, isn't it, rather than the actuality. So he's trying to set the tone. One of the things that really struck me just before the inauguration, just around late last year, at the start of January, was his tweet about sanctioning BRICS countries with a very unspecified portrayal of them either de-dollarizing by devising a BRICS currency or something else. But it's all really, I think, about rewarding a country like Argentina, for example, and sending a very strong message to a country like Brazil, again sticking in the Western Hemisphere, in terms of whether you tack closely to the US economy, whether you actually join BRICS and are actually very appreciative of your trade with China as a way of balancing out the pressure that the US can apply on you. So I think there's no need for him to suddenly impose tariffs immediately. I think he may actually want to form his first impressions as to how these countries react to him now that he's in office, whether there's a particular ask, whether there are actions that he thinks are red flag actions. There's all sorts of things I think that could happen, but it depends on where in the world you're looking.
What the world is bracing for is the question, what are the tariffs going to be? And if they are the foundation of Trump's economic policy, what results and consequences could those produce inside the United States when it comes to enhancing inflation, along with some of the continued deficit spending? That is the prediction that has united many experts before Trump was sworn in, was a prediction that, in fact, while he campaigned against inflation, that his policies that he said he was going to pursue would, in fact, be inflationary. We shall see. No real indication yet of where we're going to go. But on the tariffs, he actually has been slightly more specific in the last 24 hours, and he has said that on February 1st, he would impose a 10% tariff on China and also on China and Mexico. Or actually, that one would be higher, would be 25%, but would take effect February 1st. Now, I agree that Trump has, in the past, used tariff threats as negotiating chips. However, he has also shown in his first term that he will impose tariffs, including he shocked many of his own advisors in the first term by using the pretext of national security threats to impose tariffs on both Canada and our EU allies. And, there were many inside Trump 1.0 who were shocked by that and who said, that it was wrong to accuse Canada of being a national security threat to the United States. Trump did it nonetheless. So I definitely think you should discount those who think that somehow this is all just bluster and that he's not going to follow through. I think the exact details are to be worked out, because the other through line for Trump is to seek out and use tools which expand his own powers, that put him in the center of the negotiations, that make everything, in fact, a negotiation. There's no fixed policy. Well, if there's no fixed policy, that's a golden age for lobbyists and uncertainty, but also for the aggrandizement of the office of the president himself, if he's the one doing the negotiating.
I want to move on to the recent ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, in which Donald Trump played, as we understand it, a key role in securing. Leslie, do we have an indication of what Donald Trump's next move might be in the Middle East generally, or specifically around Israel and Hamas ceasefire?
We don't. We do know that on day 16 of that ceasefire, which is, about 2 weeks away, there needs to be the beginning of a negotiation for phase 2, which is, really where the tough issues begin about what happens to Gaza, about getting the next set of, after the first 33, more hostages back, men. And there's two things. One is if he can actually successfully, working with obviously Israel and the other players to this, successfully move through all three phases. I do think that there are broader regional ambitions, and we know that normalization is part of that between Saudi and Israel, and probably a deal with Iran. But lurking in front of all that is the question of Palestine. And the thing that's never been clear is whether Donald Trump cares, whether he has a plan, whether he wishes to form a plan for a two-state solution or for Palestinian sovereignty. And the bar to getting normalization between Saudi and Israel is much higher than it was before October 7th. Obviously, the Saudis are under pressure from their people, from the region, from the world to do something about Palestine. They can't simply ignore it at this stage. And if you, listen, and I read about the hearings for Elise Stefanik, Donald Trump's nominee to be U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, it wasn't so much about Gaza, but her statements on the West Bank don't portend well for the idea that the administration is thinking about the Palestinians or a two-state solution. It really suggests, and we'll have to see, but suggests that settlements will be supported, and that the expansion of Israel's control over the West Bank is more likely than anything that looks like, again, a solution that really takes seriously the Palestinian question.
Samir, in a sense, Donald Trump owns this ceasefire as it progresses and goes forward. He therefore has a much greater stake in attempting to see it concluded, as difficult as the circumstances and conditions of it are.
His sort of general statement of wanting to be a president for peace, paraphrasing his words, ending wars not involving or embroiling America in foreign wars, and critically, he never quite spells this out, but it's not embroiling America as a combatant, but nor as a sort of a funder and supporter of an ally who is the principal combatant either, because that's clearly the diagnosis with regards to Ukraine. So he obviously has to live up to that promise in some way, shape or form. Otherwise, it will be something that his opponents are going to thrust back into his face. I think even regardless of their particular stance on the Israel, Hamas, Palestine conflict, I think if he can't deliver on this, if he can't basically bind what his critics will call a Biden-era deal, and he can't actually allow it to move to fruition or hold for some reconstruction in the Palestinian territories to actually take place, that would be problematic. But just a last comment on the Middle East, I think his great emphasis is on the Abraham Accords, which is the diplomatic processes that do not involve the Palestinians directly at all. That's probably one of the biggest ones to watch, is Trump's outreach to Saudi Arabia and how that actually goes down, and whether because the Saudis have been pursuing with the Biden administration a bilateral security deal with the US. I have no idea whether that might be something that Trump has an opinion on in terms of an overture to the Saudis to get them enthusiastic to maybe not normalise straight away with the Israelis, but have some kind of path in that direction.
Thanks, Samir. Moving on to Ukraine, Trump's team is signalling that a deal is months away at least, which is obviously very different to his previous rhetoric. And the president also issued a warning this week to Vladimir Putin, urging him to make a deal with Ukraine, saying, I think Vladimir Putin, is destroying Russia by not making a deal. Does this represent a new tactic? What kind of response is this likely to have in the Kremlin? Susan?
Well, look, yes, first of all, we're more than 24 hours in, and Donald Trump has not ended the war in Ukraine, which he said again and again and again to great applause at his campaign rallies that he would do. We're no closer to having an answer, I think, to a couple of the really key questions that would shape the contours of any peace deal, which is number one, is the United States prepared to offer any meaningful security guarantees to Ukraine that would make any ceasefire with Russia more meaningful than the failed Minsk agreements that essentially postponed this war after Russia's illegal seizure and annexation of Crimea. There was a ceasefire, but without security for Ukraine. And I think that everyone understands that you could have a ceasefire here in which Russia sort of squats on the territory it is seized by force, but uses the period of time to regroup rather than to relinquish its claims on Ukraine. There's a big debate. It's very kind of sub rosa among Republicans in Washington and in the new Trump administration. There are a variety of viewpoints about whether you need to bolster military assistance to Ukraine in order to, really actually get Russia to come to the table. Donald Trump, in my view, does not support that. He has been very clear since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion that he did not support American assistance to Ukraine. And yet there are, the more traditional remnants of republicanism in Washington who still think that's the only rational course for Trump. So, that's an argument that I would spotlight. To Leslie's point on Palestine and Israel, Donald Trump does not support a two-state solution for Palestine. He does not support the Palestinian people. He has said extraordinarily racist and demeaning things about Palestinians. And it was one of the most shocking aspects of the campaign that just occurred to me, this idea that somehow he was going to be better for those in the United States who cared about the terrible things that were happening to Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Because Donald Trump, it's not clear what his policy is going to be toward dealing with Israel and Netanyahu, because he wants to make a deal with Saudi Arabia. He wants to do business with the Gulf, all those reasons. But it is very clear that he is not somebody who supports, the hopes, dreams, and aspirations of the Palestinian people, or that he cares one bit about the reconstruction of Gaza. Now, he sees that as a good real estate play, by the way, and he mentioned that just the other day. So I say that because I think it's also related to how you should think about what's going to play out with Ukraine now.
I'm going to ask one final question. I'd like you all to sort of address it. But given what we've seen before the inauguration and in the everything that's happened over the last few days, I wonder if we've got any early clue of a Trump foreign policy approach. His recent pronouncements around Greenland, Panama, Canada, Mexico, some have said that this might be hinting at the US embracing a spheres of influence strategy by which the US asserts itself from Greenland all the way down to Chile, largely leaving Eurasia to Russia and Asia to China. Do we have any sense that this might be where Trump is going, with a kind of broad foreign policy vision? Samir?
Well, we have to wait and see. But the things that have struck me so far with the Greenland pronouncement was the invoking, probably of a pretext, of this is in defence of the free world. And that's, Trump actually used that phrase, and that sort of language hasn't really featured too much to my memory for the first Trump administration. Any kind of notion of civilizational defence pretexts or free world pretext, he didn't really talk like that. It's still only an episodic appearance of that phraseology. I'd look very carefully to see if that phraseology comes back more prominently, even if it's disingenuous and, as you're sort of insinuating, a pretext for national aggrandizement and spheres of influence for the US.
I have a general allergy to proclaiming big doctrines of American presidents who tend to be highly reactive in their foreign policy and, pick and choose doctrines that suit the moment and then move on from them when they don't. Donald Trump was interested in Greenland originally, I would note, because a big money donor friend of his, Ron Lauder, the cosmetics heir, whispered in his ear about it early on in the Trump 1.0 presidency. This was, we did reporting for this in our book. We were really surprised to know that it wasn't just a random kind of idea in 2019 that got, headlines at the moment when he put it out there publicly, but he was obsessed with it for years in his Trump first term. But, his own advisors didn't take him seriously, tried to steer him off of it. He liked the idea of himself as a grand figure in history. He wanted to be like Secretary of State Seward, who purchased Alaska for the United States. He wanted to be like Thomas Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase. So when you're looking for some magic Rosetta Stone that's going to tell you about Donald Trump's foreign policy, right? Don't look to ideology, although it is true, I think, that he really is at heart what you might call a kind of a great power throwback nationalist. Of course, he loves imperialist bluster and, sort of Teddy Rooseveltian, swagger on the world stage. But essentially, what he wants is a grandiose conception of himself as one of the world's most powerful men, sitting down as an equal and a peer with Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping.
Thank you, Susan. I'm just going to throw a sort of tricky question to you, Leslie, at the end, and that's just, do you see, there were lots of fears and concerns about some of the policies that Trump has announced this week, but do you see anything positive in his approach?
It's such a big question that it's sort of hard to parse, but sure, if Donald Trump's provocations raise the bar for Russia or for China on certain of the big geopolitical questions in their regions, if it gets Iran sort of sitting up straight and thinking about dialing down, Israel's already done a lot to make this possible, but dialing down its regional adventurism and attacks. And if folks are sort of waiting to see how tough the pushback is, then there's a possibility with a president who follows through and uses his team and leverages American power to clearly communicate America's priorities, its commitments, and the conditions under it which it will do things like leverage sanctions or release sanctions or use force, then that's a good thing. So there's undoubtedly, given the strength of the economy that he's been given the weight of America's military power, and given a very disrupted world, there's a lot to play for.
I'd just like to say thank you to all of my guests here today. That's Leslie Vinjamuri, Samir Puri, and Susan Glasser. Follow them all on X and Blue Sky, where you can also find Chatham House. All the details are in the show notes. This week at Chatham House, we have hosted 2 Donald Trump-related events, one on US-China relations and the second on America's wider foreign policies. We're also asking, how can Europe be safer together with the former president of Finland? Head over to chathamhouse.org for more on those events, or find the live streams on our social media or on YouTube. You can also find The World Today at the Chatham House website. All the articles in the winter issue are free to read. The spring issue of the magazine will be out in March. A reminder that you can listen to all episodes of Independent Thinking on Apple, Spotify, and all major podcast platforms, as well as through our social media channels. Please like, follow, and subscribe, and tell your friends. For now, that's it from me, Mike Higgins. See you next time.